Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell. I'm your host. And today I'm pleased to introduce and welcome Keith Regular. Keith, you're an author here based in Cranbrook, so welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
So I just really wanted to commend you on your new book, just released this spring. And Rough and Messy Justice. So can you just give us a quick snapshot of what the book was all about?
Well, the book is about an event that occurred in the Crow's Nest Pass of Alberta in August of 1920 and following with the trial and that. It was a very fascinating event in that it was constituted of a train robbery, an armed train robbery, plus several murders, the apprehension of an escaped train robber and supposed murder, and his trial and execution. Okay. And so it all came together in a fascinating way.
Okay, so look forward to sort of delving into that story a little bit more. First of all, let's set our geographical scope here. So many of us have driven through the Crow's Nest Pass over the years, and if I remember right, the train robbery actually took place in a little place called Sentinel. And but the event that we're going to talk a little bit about actually happened in Bellevue. So can you give us a little bit of an idea where these communities are and geographically the layout of the Crow's Nest Pass?
The Crow's Nest Pass actually extends from about Lunbrick in Alberta through the pass itself down into British Columbia and as far west officially as Elko. Mm-hmm. That constitutes the pass. Mm-hmm. So the train robbery occurred between Coleman and the old community of Crow's Nest, which is right on the BC-Alberta border.
So just to get my bearings there, as you come over the hump into Alberta, if you look down, there's a little sort of settlement or hotel and so forth. That would have been Crow's Nest?
That's correct.
Okay, and so we're talking just beyond that would be Sentinel?
Yes, just beyond that, between that and Coleman.
Okay, so the train robbery happened there. So tell me about the other communities and maybe specifically Bellevue as well.
The other communities in the past are chiefly Blairmore and Bellevue and Hillcrest, and today what's left of the old community of Frank. Right. And Bellevue is on the far eastern end of the pass, basically, up across the valley from where Hillcrest is, which is a site of the mine disaster in about 1914, I think, thereabouts. Mm-hmm. And of course near Frank, where the Great Frank Slide occurred.
Right. Okay, so it gives us a little bit of an idea. Popped up in your book as well, a little community called Passburg. So where's Passburg?
Passburg no longer exists. It's an old community, and it's also in the eastern end of the pass.
Okay. Okay, so here's the setting. So you've got this train robbery that happens, which subsequently led to a manhunt, which culminated in a shootout at the Bellevue Cafe. So tell me how that all sort of went together, who was involved, and what took place.
Essentially what happened was that three Russian immigrants by the name of Tom Basov, George Akroff, and Alex Oloff boarded the train in Lethbridge, and they had tickets to Crow's Nest. Not sure exactly why they wanted to go to Crow's Nest, but they were armed, and the train ride was uneventful until the train pulled out of Coleman. And it was only out of Coleman a few minutes when they pulled their weapons and ordered the passengers to hold up their hands, and they proceeded to rob them. They were not masked. They made no attempt to stop the train. The train continued in motion. They had basically finished a robbery as such when the train pulled into Sentinel siding and stopped to let passengers off. They panicked and they fled the train. They spent a night apparently down on the Crow's Nest River. In the morning, the three robbers had a disagreement, and Olaf left Bassoff and Aycroft, and he returned east to Lethbridge on a train, by the way, and crossed the border in the south and went back to Montana and went to Butte to work in the mines. Bassoff and Aycroft hung around and in hiding. There were a number of spottings, supposedly, but they remained in hiding for 5 days. And on the early afternoon, basically, of Saturday, August the 7th, they wandered into Bellevue. They walked up the main street. They stopped, strangely enough, to look through the office window of the Justice of the Peace, where they were noticed. And then they wandered right next door and went into the Bellevue Cafe. Now, the entrance to the Bellevue Cafe is narrow, but when you get inside, there were 4 curtained booths on the inside on the north wall. They entered a second booth, and they ordered lunch. And they were having their lunch, unbeknownst to most people that they were the robbers. When there was a call made to the APP, Alberta Provincial Police Detachment, which was just up the street. The call supposedly came from Blairmore, and it warned the police that they thought that the train robbers had entered Bellevue. So the police went down the street, 3 officers, Constable Freeman of the APP and Constable...
the Alberta Provincial Police.
Right, and Constable Bailey of the APP and Corporal Usher of the RCMP. Okay. They went to make an arrest.
Okay, so I'm going to stop you there. So that sort of gives us the setting of what's going on. I want to go back to the train for a moment, because you got these 3 so-called bandits holding up the train, but they really get virtually nothing out of it, right? Maybe some jewelry, some loose change, that kind of thing. I think if you mentioned within the book that it may have added up to $300 or $400 at the most.
That's correct.
So there is speculation, and I think you referred to it, that they may have been after a bigger prize. What was that all about?
Well, the speculation is that they were after Emperor Pic, or Emilio Picarello, who was the most notorious bootlegger in the Crow's Nest Pass at the time. It was rumored that he used to travel between Lethbridge and his headquarters in Blairmore with large sums of cash. And so they were after him to rob him. That is speculation. There is no evidence that that was the case, and there was no evidence that I have found that Picarello was actually on the train.
Okay. So is there a passenger list? Do we know who was on the train?
There was a basic passenger list. For example, I did find the names of the people who were personally robbed, at least some of them. And we do know that there was a CPR surveyor by the name of McLeod on the train, and of course the train's crew.
And several residents, I believe, from Fernie?
Yes, residents from Fernie, and a couple who lived apparently around Sentinel, because they were getting off at Sentinel Siding.
Right. So these 3 so-called criminals were pretty bold. As you said, they weren't masked. They didn't try to hide their actions, whatever. But evidently, as you mentioned, they had connections to possibly some criminal elements in Great Falls, in Montana. Do you think, had they been in the Crow's Nest Pass for a long time, would people recognize who they were? Or were they just basically going on the idea that nobody would know who they were anyways?
It's actually hard to know. I do know that Bassoff in particular occasionally came into the Crow's Nest to work either in the mines, but most likely into the lumber camps around Fernie, which supplied the mines, of course, with what they needed, their props and that. But they may have been back and forth. Speculation again in the press that they were part of a gang of thieves that operated in Montana. But so far, I have found no hard proof of it. But speculation is that they certainly had criminal background.
Right. So they had some criminality associated with them to some degree? All three of them?
Yes, as far as I can tell, all three.
Okay. Okay, so let's go back to the cafe. So you've got to the point where, the police are ready to arrest these characters. How did everything go wrong from that point on?
Well, it went wrong. I guess it started to go wrong with the train robbery and the fact they weren't masked and et cetera. But it went really wrong when the police attempted the arrest in the cafe. And one of the major problems, I think, which became a huge issue in terms of a peaceful arrest, was that the man in charge, Corporal Freewen, was actually in civilian clothing. Right. He was not in uniform.
So is there any reason why that was?
I can discover none. He was dispatched by his superior officer from, I believe, Coleman that morning to go to Bellevue. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming to confer with the police officers there.
So he was a regular Alberta police officer?
Yes.
Okay. So just give us a little, before we get into that, give us just a little bit of the dynamics of what was going on in policing in the Crow's Nest Pass at that point in time.
The big issue in the Crow's Nest Pass at this time, of course, was prohibition. Mm-hmm. And there were police around dealing with that, and actually dealing with Emperor Picarello, mm-hmm. who was their prized target.
But there seemed to be a number of police forces sometimes at odds with each other.
Yes, there were jurisdictional disputes during this manhunt and later, because you had the APP, which was basically was formed in 1917. And they were, I think, by 1920 still trying to find their feet, even though some of them were ex-RCMP officers. Mm-hmm. Then you had the RCMP. They had given up policing in Alberta in 1917 during the war to focus more on federal problems during the war. But they did have an office, if you want, or a divisional headquarters in Fernie and another one in Lethbridge. And so they were around anyway to help out if need be. And then you had the CPR police that we don't often think of, but the CPR had its own police force.
Still do to this day.
Yes, they do. And all three of them engaged in the manhunt once the banditry had occurred on the train, and especially following the shootout in the cafe.
Okay, so that takes us to Saturday afternoon. Freewen, not dressed in a police uniform, bursts into the cafe, basically sticks a pistol in the guy's face and says, "You're under arrest." How did that go over?
It didn't go very well at all, and there's a dispute about what Freewen did during the arrest. He said later that he identified himself as a police officer and told Acroft and Bassoff that they were under arrest. But anyway, Acroft, seated to the left of the table, and Bassoff on the right, seemed to pay no attention to the fact that submission was demanded by the police. And according to Freewen, Acroft reached for his coat, which was on a chair, and Freewen said that he saw the barrel of a pistol sticking out of the coat pocket. What happened after that appears to have been that Freewen panicked, and he basically opened fire without any more warning, and he unloaded his pistol into Acroft. Acroft toppled off his chair onto the floor. While that's happening, Usher approaches Bassoff with a drawn pistol.
Usher is the
RCMP officer. Yeah. He's in uniform. And but Bassoff, obviously being very gutsy, he reached out and he grabbed Usher's pistol by the barrel and forced the barrel towards the floor. As far as it can be seen, Usher opened fire and he wounded Bassoff in the thigh, and then emptied the rest of his pistol around into the floor, into the wall. And then Usher, left his pistol with Bassoff and started to back away. In the meantime, Constable Bailey of the APP, who had gone around to the back door and entered the cafe through the kitchen, he joined the fray by putting his pistol around Frewen to engage, and then Frewen, still in a panic, flees while shouting at Bailey to continue shooting. Right. And Frewen leaves the cafe, goes out around the corner and hides, leaving Bailey with a weapon and Usher without a weapon to face Aycroft and Bassoff, who are both armed.
Right. So pandemonium for sure, lots of chaos going on. I think the story goes that they all end up stumbling out the door and tripping over one another, and the two officers end up prone on the sidewalk, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct.
Yeah, and then there's conjecture at this point in time that Bassoff came out wounded but still capable of firing his arms, and what did he do then?
Well, according to witnesses, and this is something that I analyze in the book, according to witnesses, Bassoff is the one who, after he emerges from the cafe, who brutally executes both Usher, who has fallen in the doorway wounded, and Bailey, who has fallen to the sidewalk and hit himself hard and is stunned. And apparently, after shooting Usher, I believe, he turns his attention to Bailey, who is rising because he's coming to his senses, and Bassoff supposedly placed a gun to Bailey's head and shoots him.
Right. So a pretty gory, bloody scene happening there. But in the meantime, we've got, is it Aycroft? Is he trying to escape as well?
George Aycroft. He leaves the cafe severely wounded, mortally wounded actually, and leans up against the cafe once he gets outside for support, and then stumbles out into the street and collapses and dies. Right. Bassoff, in the meantime, with his leg wound, flees, goes down the street, around the corner, and makes his way into the rubble of the Frank Slide, and he hides.
Right. Okay, so we've got this drama playing out, and surprise, surprise, Frewen, which was the original instigator of this, has basically had a mental breakdown and is in hiding.
Yes, so. And his breakdown continues, actually. What needs to be said here, too, is that Frewen actually had two weapons. So when he fled the cafe, he still had a fully loaded pistol, but he didn't stay, and he got outside and pulled his pistol. But he has such a mental collapse that when a citizen approaches him about tracking down Bassoff, immediately to try to capture him, Frewen just gives the citizen his loaded pistol and doesn't even realize what he's doing. And so when Frewen is later found by the RCMP officer, he's insensible and weaponless. Right.
Yeah, so just another element to this intriguing story. So as this progresses, Bassoff flees. There's a manhunt for him.
Right.
That goes on for 4 or 5 days, if I'm not mistaken.
4 days, I believe, yes.
Yeah. And they eventually do catch him. Where do they track him down at?
Well, after he flees, he hides in the rubble of the slide for a day or so. He then makes his way overland, walking, hobbling, along the trails. He crosses the river, Crow's Nest River, near Lundbrick, and then makes his way along the railroad line until he gets to what was at the time sometimes called Pincher City or Pincher Station. And he goes into there's a community there, and he goes into a store, and he purchases some food, and he goes to a shack to eat. And there's a report that he's been noticed by a CPR employee on a pusher car. And they start hunting for him, and the CPR police actually are the ones that make the arrest in this shack that he's hiding in.
Right. So modern day, if you're driving to Pincher Creek, pincher stations on the north side of so where the railway tracks are. So just to give you a little bit of a landmark, the grain elevators are on that side as well. So, okay, so that dramatically sort of brings this to an end. But really, it's just the start, because then there's been the arrest. Now there's the trial, and this is a very public display of violence, because there's eyewitnesses, there's people that are watching this from various angles, and yet it's difficult to detect or come up with the exact story of what happened. So who was it that was there that witnessed what was going on?
Well, there were several witnesses, actually. People who were occupying the pool hall and the barber shop were looking out. But the key witness of all, actually, was the Justice of the Peace, Joseph Robertson, because he was out in the street when the shootout was going on with his .22 pistol hiding behind a telephone pole, watching it all. And he actually engaged in the shootout by firing some shots at, according to his testimony, it seemed to be at Aycroft, who was mortally wounded and on the ground, and not at Bassoff, but that's kind of hard to figure out. But when they did call the witnesses at the trial, what is very noticeable is the contradictions in what they say they saw. And what is also interesting is that Robertson's testimony changes. So I had the benefit of having statements that were given to the police following the shootout, that were also given during the coroner's inquest, that were given at the preliminary inquiry, and then given at trial. Right. And the one thing that jumps out at you is that there's a great deal of variety, not only in what they say, but also in what the same person says. And in particular, noticeable is the testimony from Robertson himself.
Right. So ironically, the three criminals or gangsters or whatever we want to call them, it was Robertson's window that they peered into the start with, right?
Right.
Okay, yeah. So do you think that maybe tipped him off that there was something going on?
Well, actually it did, because he was sitting behind his desk. He said it did. He was sitting behind his desk when he noticed, I guess maybe by shadows, that someone was staring into his window. He said he looked up and he noticed that one of the people, and he'd be referring to Bassoff, seemed to have a bad cast in his eye, which would make sense because Bassoff had a glass eye. And the police even suggested that be on the lookout for him, but you had to be careful because he could remove his glass eye as a way of disguise.
Right.
So, yeah. But I guess if you wanted to draw attention to yourself, you wouldn't remove your glass eye. I don't know.
Yeah, so colorful and interesting story. So let's just talk a little bit about what transpired. So the trial was held in McLeod?
Yes, McLeod.
Okay, and there were some, like you said, irregularities between what was actually presented at the trial, what was presented at the preliminary hearings, and there seemed to be a fair amount of switching of memory and not actually maybe even making up some of it as they went along.
Right.
So just tell me, how did the trial transpire?
The trial opened with a defense lawyer being parachuted into the case basically on the morning of the trial. But the trial wasn't delayed, and so basically what you have is a defense lawyer who has no time to interview his client, to study the evidence, to look at the police reports, to basically, craft a defense. But the trial proceeds. But what stands out with the trial is that, again, the conflicting witness testimony, but also a problem, and I think a huge problem, is the fact that the physical evidence is contradictory also in terms of who committed the crime. But it goes unnoticed. For example, there really isn't any physical evidence to definitively tie Thomas Bassoff to the murder of Constable Bailey. And that's the only...
That was who he was charged
That's
for.
who he was charged with. He wasn't charged with Usher at all. I'm assuming it's because the prosecution decided that if they failed in convicting him for Bailey's murder, they could then put him on trial for Usher's murder. But the inconsistencies seem to have gone unnoticed by both the prosecution and the defense, and also by the judge.
So I have to say your book surprised me to some degree, or some unexpected turn, because it became somewhat of a social commentary on what was going on at the time.
Yes.
In the fact that there was incompetence, there seemed to be prejudice, there was bias, there was a whole lot of things that were going on that were sort of influencing not only the arrest and the suspicion of these characters, but also the trial. So can you just talk a little bit about what was going on at that particular time in the Crow's Nest?
Well, the Crow's Nest, of course, was a mining community, and there were large groups of foreign people or people of foreign extraction who may have been at the time citizens. Certainly large groups of Italians and Ukrainians and some Russians and etc. But prejudice was rife. I mean, prejudice at this time in Canadian society was systemic. And white Anglo-Saxon Canadians believed themselves to be the top-notch in society, behaved as if they were, and oftentimes looked down their noses at people who were different. And it was no different, the press reflected that. The police reports reflected that. The behavior of the judge in the trial reflected that in one very noticeable reference. And so it would be difficult in the circumstances for an accused foreign person to get a fair trial. And studies have shown that if you were of foreign extraction, you were more likely to end up in a capital offense to be sentenced to death and hanged. Not strange to be sentenced to death, because every murder at this time, if you were found guilty, the death sentence was automatic. But whether or not that was carried out is a different matter.
Right. And that was the fate of Bashoff. He was convicted, was hung in Lethbridge, is that correct?
That's correct.
Well, I have to say, Keith, tremendous amount of research went into your book. I enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
Very, very, very detailed. And I just wanted to take a minute before we wrapped up. Tell us about how you actually got to the point of publishing it and who published it for you.
Okay, well, the book I wrote it actually, as I do all of these things, strictly from interest. I love research and I love writing, so that's why it happened. I wasn't even sure it would get published, because when I looked at it, I thought it was, it was so localized in terms of an event that there might not be any general interest. When I was finally done, I realized that it was more to it than just a local story. So I submitted it to Derville and Uproot Books in Calgary, and was very pleased that they accepted it. And the owner of Derville, Laureen Scheiba, she took the manuscript and ran with it, and it was wonderful. I mean, the work she did and the promotion she's been giving it, et cetera, has been just fantastic.
So, Rough and Messy Justice, name of the book. Keith Regular, you're the author. Thank you for being a guest on Talking Kootenay Books, giving us a little bit of an insight into that story, which really is just across the border.
Indeed, and thank you for your interest, and it was a pleasure to be here.
Well, wishing you much success in your future projects as well. This is Talking Kootenay Books, and I'm Keith Powell.